So, Keanan, you run the Psyched Minds Podcast. Can you give me an idea a little bit about what that is, what your goals are with that, and kind of just like what you're doing with that?
Okay, so the podcast I started this year only. Like, I'm also pretty new in it. And I think, yeah, I'm going for 11 episodes on Monday. And what initially inspired me to do the podcast? Well, I've had this idea in my mind for quite some time. Like last year, I was telling friends, I have this idea for a podcast. I want to do this. Da 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 da. And it was always, just telling people about it, but never actually getting down to doing it. And part of the thing with the podcast is when I look at my journey until now. So I first did engineering and I did it for quite some time. I failed many times and still tried and persevere. But my heart just never was in it. There was stuff that happened in my family life. Um, and it always seemed like I'm having an uphill battle. And then I decided to switch to psychology because I saw I have some aptitude there. I have a passion for it, a lot of interest in it.
Sure.
Where this ties into the podcast, it's, what do I wish I knew when I was younger? What are some of the lessons I wish I learned? So, on the one hand, I can share that, doing the podcast, but it's also not just me sharing knowledge that I've learned. I still want to learn a lot more. Like, there's so much stuff when I'm reading now, like, I read a lot more than I've ever read. And even when I read, there's like questions that pop up, and it's one thing you can get information from books all the time, but you never get a full nuanced view of things.
Sure.
The author will always give you a better answer. Somebody that has had a lived experience doing something or researching something will have better answers than you can ever find on your own, especially if it's somebody that has dedicated years to a particular topic. So my podcast, my intention is to get experts in different fields. So particularly fields and stuff that I'm interested in. And then
Sure.
it's authors of books that I'm interested in that speak on the issues and topics that I want to know more about. And then I also want to have it's experts, authors, and researchers. So people that have done interesting research that I'm into.
Yeah, I saw you recently had like an astronomer on your most recent podcast, right?
Yeah. So
Very cool.
astronomy is like growing here in South Africa slowly but surely. So I was interested, like, where is it going? How is it going to shape the country and that sort of thing? Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. You said people who are researchers, people who are authors. What other subjects might like be like the target demographic for you to interview or talk with?
Okay, so I can speak on the guests that I have coming on now soon because they are actually people in the field specifically that I'm interested in. So when you're starting out podcasting, there's kind of the sense that you don't know exactly what you want to talk about.
Sure.
So I found myself like fumbling to find what guests I want to have. So
Yeah,
initially I was thinking, okay, I have people that are successful in business and then look at the mindset behind it because my passion is in psychology. So that's why it's psyched minds. It's understanding what goes on in people's minds.
sure.
So I try and look for anybody that has insight and knowledge that they can share why they did something, how they maybe achieved something, if it's an entrepreneur or something. But it's in terms of research, it's looking at like research that tells you something about the way people are, the way people think, and the way people do things.
It sounds kind of like you enjoy like talking to people who might give you perspectives that clue you into why people act the way that they do.
Yes. Yeah. And like recently, I had researchers that researched the dynamics of phishing, um, what people are more susceptible to being victims of phishing. And that for me was very interesting because, a fraud or scam, it plays heavily on psychology. It's the same sort of dynamics that one might use for marketing or for sales being
Sure.
weaponized in a malicious manner.
Yeah, in many ways, they're very much the same tactics, just used in different ways. That's really interesting because it really is just tapping into human psychology, understanding like how to evoke fear or an emotion that might elicit the type of response that gets someone to take action. Because when you can catch someone in a vulnerable state, they're a lot easier to kind of control and manipulate in that way. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and doing the episode, like for myself, I also realize it's not just about not trying to be a victim of a scam, but it's also the underlying psychology that is at play, like concepts like amygdala hijacking. So it's where somebody puts you in an emotional state where you don't think before you act. It's where you have that instinctual reactions, and when you're in that space, your decision making is compromised, and you more often than not regret what you did. Like they take advantage of your urge for safety, where they will say,
Sure.
if you don't do this, XYZ will happen, and then you take action because you think it's the best action to take.
Sure.
Yeah, so other guests that I have coming up, it's also like in the psychology space. So two are authors on this book called Serial Killers. So looking at different serial killers in South Africa, the stories behind them, goes on in their minds, how they look at it. So the one of the authors is actually a psychologist, so looking at how he interacted with them. How do you deal with somebody? How does somebody that is a convicted serial killer find redemption, like once they serve the sentence?
Yeah.
And the other guest is a author of a book called Daddy Issues, so looking at the dynamics that um, I play between a father and a daughter, and how different women grew up in different situations. So those are books that I read and I found interesting. And this is where I find a value in doing a podcast, because if I didn't do the podcast, would I even bothered reaching out to them to, you know, engage with them and
Yeah.
delve deeper in what they write? Yeah.
So I'm curious how you manage to like how do you exactly reach out and get these people into your podcasts? Because what I've noticed when I've started
Yeah.
this is it's been very difficult for me to get people to want to come on a podcast that I'm just starting because I don't really have a following and I'm not very good at it yet, right? As you can
Yeah.
probably tell. And so it's been
No,
hard
you're
for me
doing
to like
amazing.
oh well, I appreciate that. That's very kind. But I guess I'm curious to know like what kind of process you have for getting guests to agree to come on your podcast. Do you have any systems in place, or is it just as simple as like sending an email?
It really differs. Like I do everything I can. So looking on Reddit, like that's where you found me. We
Yes.
messaged each other on Reddit. Like there, looking for guests in any space that you can. There's this quote by Nietzsche that I like, and it's he who knows why can be anyhow. And I always have
Repeat
that in
repeat the
my mind.
quote. Sorry.
He who knows why can be anyhow, or he who has a why can be anyhow.
Okay, so similar to like knowledge is power. It sounds similar to that. Like
No, so he who knows why can be anyhow. It's basically if you have a reason for doing something, you're willing to persist with whatever adversity comes along the way. You know, you are
sure.
willing to do whatever it takes to achieve the end result. And it's with the podcast when I think at first I was really uncertain how I'm going to get guests. It's I was really questioning, okay, what am I going to do? Where am I going to get? I'm going to have to meet people in person. But as you do it more and more, you start becoming a bit more creative in the way you try to look for guests. So with the
Sure.
authors, I literally email them. But it's not just emailing you would know, it's the way you um, communicate the message. Because podcasting is actually fascinating. You're not only advertising to listeners, you're advertising to guests as well. It's like you
Yeah,
have to sell to both sides at the same time.
absolutely.
And well, you in the start, you do not have the reputation, but what you can have is proof of concept. So if people see your podcast, they see it online, they can see the way you do it. If you show a genuine interest in the person you are speaking with, and you actively try and improve the podcast, or you're constantly doing work for it, it communicates a lot more than having a lot of followers heard.
That's a really good point.
Also sell it to the guests, like show them why you think they would be a good guest. Say this is what or you maybe say this is how I heard about you or something. This is what my podcast is about. This is why I think you'll be a guest. It's a lot of you have to have somewhat of a sales mind running in the background.
Sure.
And communicating what the podcast is, where you're going to post it, give that sort of knowledge and background to it as well. Being optimistic helps a lot because,
yeah,
there's this quote by Sean Puri that I also like. It's pessimists get to be right, optimists get to be rich. You're going to fail a lot. You're going to get rejected a lot. There's going to be so many people you email and get absolutely no response.
Yeah,
but
no
that's
doubt.
not a bad thing, because when you get the yeses, it's like, whoa, I was not expecting that. Like, it feels so much better.
Well, yeah, that's very true, and it's also the reason that I'm gratified to be joined here with you today. The fact that you agreed to be on this podcast and talk to me and share your own insights is something that's very exciting. So I do appreciate that. I think that's a great point. I think people can kind of people are able to see through beyond follower count. And I think there's an increasing hunger for that sort of thing. People want like real content on YouTube or in their podcast or whatever medium it is. I think people are starting to crave for content that's beyond just that which caters to the lowest rung of the majority of people, if that makes sense. That might sound a bit abstract, but I think people do. There's an increasing hunger for quality content and authentic exchanges. And so I think you make a really good point in that.
Yeah, and that's part of branding. Branding is not just everything you are, it's what you are not as well.
Very true.
You are going to alienate somebody. So, well, do exactly what you want and alienate the people that would not like your content.
What's the number one group that you would what's like the number one demographic that you would alienate if you had to single one out for the type of content that you make in your own podcast? Who do you think it's not for?
If I have to think, okay, I'm very bad at articulating exactly because I don't look at people as a particular demographic, like in terms of marketing, people want to know this age demographic,
or then think
this
psychographics.
Ethnic group or something. But what it'd be is a good contrast I can give is in South Africa, our biggest podcasts are comedy podcasts, or it's podcasts where it's people talking like they know stuff, like it's a lot of hearsay where it's the type of podcast like I don't know, I can't think of because I don't watch those. But it's where it's just guys sitting and then they talk like they know everything about dating, they know everything about people, they know all the politics and that sort of thing. Like it's a lot of speculation and opinion, but very little substance behind it. Where it's just a couple of guys chilling and talking. I would want it geared towards anybody that's got the sense of curiosity, that wants to learn things, that wants to learn about themselves, that wants to learn about the world, that wants to make a difference in the world. That when they listen to a podcast, they're looking to grow in some capacity after listening to it. That is how I would describe my ideal listener. It would be somebody similar to me.
So someone who's looking for more than just entertainment alone, but looking to learn something about themselves or about the world around them or a given profession or a school of thought, if you will. Is that kind of...
Yeah, that is very succinct.
For sure. What kind of experiences might have led you to wanting to start this type of project? Maybe was it certain working experiences? Did you have certain maybe experiences as a young man or a child that led you to being more inquisitive about these psychological subjects?
Well, I'm a very introvert person and I don't speak with that many people. And, I think it's also Nietzsche, but a quote that really resonates with me, and it's, I desire to speak with another as deeply as I speak with myself.
Sure.
And, it's this where I would be reading all these things, I would be having all this interest, and nobody to share it with, and
Yeah.
it kind of feels lonely. And, on the one hand, you can wallow in your corner and make excuses for I'm so different from everybody. Or you can get up and go and find the others. Find the people you would want to talk with, have the conversations you want to. And the podcast is a convenient excuse for that. Even if
Sure.
I don't get anything else from the podcast, I feel good having conversations that interest me. It's
That's
even
such a
if
good
I don't
answer, man.
build it up, I can do it perpetually without any reward. Like it's very rewarding for me. And in terms of experiences, it's I was not always somebody that thought deeply about things. So when I finished school, like in school, I didn't have any close friends. Like I had guys I would hang out with, but it was more just hanging out and not to be lonely.
Sure.
And then I went and study engineering because from an early age I had this in my mind that I will become an engineer. But I think it was grade 11 and I started having these ideas that, psychology interests me. So we read a book and I don't remember the book's name, but it was about these two Jewish boys. And the one boy had this interest in psychology, particularly the works of Freud. And at that point, I started getting into lucid dreaming and all of that sort of things. But when it came to making the decision, like I had a whole bunch of people around me saying psychology is stupid. Like I had an uncle saying he doesn't understand how people can do psychology. There's no money in it, and that skewed my thoughts to going and doing engineering. And when I did it, it's how like that's also one of the curses of being pretty smart because I could pass in everything despite not really having a passion or interest for it. Like
Right.
at one point I was interested in cars and the way cars work and all that things, but by the time I got to matric it died out. Like I didn't care about cars and motor vehicles and all that things. And when I was studying, it's battling with these thoughts in my mind that I'm different. Like you feel very different. Like I started reading other stuff, and my field of interest just changed. Like I don't know how to describe it. On the one hand, I could
Sure.
say it was maybe just maturing. Um, yeah, and there was one year where there was a lot of stuff that happened at home. My father got shot, was in a hospital, and it
Wow.
was like I couldn't think clearly. Went and sat in an exam, and I was completely blank. It was the first time it ever happened. Walked in the exam room, sat down, and there wasn't a single thought coming in my mind. Like, this sounds amazing if you're trying to meditate, because that is the
Right.
exact goal, the exact state you want to be in. But when you're
Absolutely.
in the place of an exam venue and you have to actually answer these questions in front of you, and it's like, this is purgatory, this is hell, it's the worst place I can be in. And then I failed that year, and the next year I repeated a few classes, and there was a book I read, 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. So I started seeing his videos on YouTube and I was interested in what he said, got the book.
Sure.
And there was a chapter in the book that really resonated with me, and it's which was the chapter? I think it's do not hide unwanted things in the fog or something like that. I don't remember. But there's a passage where he says, when you do not articulate your desires and wants or something like that, you end up being this student doing engineering when you actually have a passion for something else, for psychology. Like that
Sure.
example sound way too close to home. And there was stuff that happened that year that where I had to play the role of basically being there for my mother, for my brothers, comforting them, and basically putting myself in the role of a psychologist, listening.
And how old were you during that time?
So I was 27,
27.
so
Okay.
really older than, yeah.
So
And
not long ago.
no, it's pretty recently.
Sure.
Yeah. And in the midst of that, like, I really enjoyed listening to them, speaking with them, taking that interest. And, when I look at myself, all the doubts that I have, like, in the midst of all of this, it's one of the things when you have struggles at home with family and everything, it makes it very difficult to date and stuff. And you start, as I get older, I'm single the whole time, it starts playing in your mind. I start seeing all these negative thoughts come in. And it gets to the point where, I start flirting with suicide myself and having these thoughts and abandoning it. And, it was through working on myself, looking at myself through a different lens, looking at what talents do I have that, maybe don't seem as valuable on the surface, but ultimately have utility elsewhere. Like there's the quantifiable metrics, the stuff you can say, if I complete this degree and I go work, I make so much money. But
Right.
let's say I get the degree and I go and work and all of that, is that going to really change a lot in my life about how the way I feel about myself? So if I uh, go start working as an engineer, I'm still going to be on my own. I'm not like I've been single for so long. I don't talk with people. Am I going to have the skills one day magically that I'm just going to go up to the girl of my dreams and I'm suddenly going to be Casanova and it's all going to be happily ever after? I'm going to have the
Sure.
money, I'm going to have the family and all of that.
Not likely that it would change that
It's
fast.
going to happen. Yeah. So then that's where I made the switch. So, it's those experiences where I start looking at the value of the way you feel about yourself, the way you think about the world, the way your cognition shapes your experience of life. That inspired me to make the switch to psychology, and that inspired me with the podcast as well. It's where
Sure.
I can bring these insights and knowledge that I've acquired over years, that I've read from books, and incorporate that into conversations with people that are more knowledgeable on stuff than I am as well. So, every
Yeah.
conversation I try and bring that psychology element, but I also bring somewhat, my personal touch.
Yeah, you touch on a reason that's very similar to the reason that I started this podcast, and that's because kind of like you said earlier, it's like we always read books and we consume content that we're interested in, but how often do we really get to sit down without phones, uninterrupted, and engage in dialogue for a long form period of time, not just surface level exchanges? But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the reason that I started this, that seems similar to the reason that you did, is because it's, I don't want to use the term excuse, but it's a reason to have access to these types of conversations and to talk with people that are in different fields that I might not normally have access to, or that might be like just so much like far and away smarter than me that I wouldn't have access to them. And so it sounds very similar to when you said why you started your podcast. Like that's the main reason I started mine, is to be able to have access to those types of conversations because I find it very valuable.
Yeah, I definitely relate with that story. Like, it sounds very much the same. And, it's having those conversations also give you direction, like guiding.
Yeah.
You find the conversations you enjoy, and then that gives you sort of an indication. These are the conversations I want to have more of, and then you find more of those guests, and you'll get them wherever you can. Like you'll become creative if you really want somebody as a guest. Yeah.
So you also had mentioned a little bit about how you had during that period where you were kind of thinking about, should I maybe try to find something I could do with psychology as opposed to engineering, and you were kind of I forget the term you used, but you said you're kind of doing some inquiry, trying to ask yourself like, what should I be doing? How do you do that? What kind of mental disciplines or methods do you personally use to kind of take a step back and think about those sort of things?
Okay, so I'm actually studying psychology now, and the place that I'm studying, we I have like a lot of questions and stuff. So we have like I don't want to say ongoing assessments. It's like optional. You can do it or not. But there's a lot of stuff where they ask you what are your biases, and you actually have to engage with it and look at it, from a different lens. Like try and place yourself outside of yourself, but also at the same time look at yourself. So what I find works very well, aside from that, is reading books that um, books that actually force you to engage with different ideas and concepts. So it
Sure.
doesn't have to be just non-fiction. Like a big mistake we can make is to think self-work needs you just reading self-help books or non-fiction particularly. There's a lot of value in reading fiction because stories resonate with us because we place ourselves in the shoes of the characters that we read about.
Absolutely.
And a book that I read recently that really resonated with me, where I started tackling a lot of values that I have myself, is The Brothers Karamazov. And, it dealt with concepts of God, of religion versus science and intellect, and also like genetic predisposition, because in the book the father's an alcoholic. He's like this horrible man, and the younger son Alyosha, he has within himself this battle of, do I have this within me? Like he wants to be saintly and everything, but he also recognizes that there's this potential within him. Reading books that inspire you to think about things, look at the world, look at yourself in a different lens. For me, the book that kickstarted it all, again, 12 Rules for Life, it really forced me to tackle with a lot of concepts. And
Sure.
it's a book I would recommend for anybody just because of the impact it had for me. And
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I should, and I probably will someday because I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. Um, yeah, you'd mentioned that you had mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier. Are you a fan of his?
yeah, when I say fan, I follow a lot of his work and stuff. But in the midst of all of that, there are stuff that I maybe do not agree with him entirely, but
Sure.
there's a lot of value I take out of watching his videos, listening to his podcast. Yeah, I am definitely a big fan. And I've seen reading the book and applying stuff, the value it had for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I would probably feel or say the same thing. I feel very similarly in that I might not agree with everything that he thinks. Like no one agrees on everything, right? But I personally really, really enjoy listening to him talk because he's obviously a lot smarter than I am, and so I get a lot of value from that. I like listening to his podcast with his other like philosopher friends. I find that very stimulating, especially when they disagree. I really like when two people who are smarter than me and more educated than I am disagree with each other, and it forces me to kind of level up my own way of thinking about something I probably haven't thought about very much, admittedly. So I do enjoy those types of things. Are you familiar with Sam Harris at all?
Oh yeah, I know Sam Harris. Yeah, I'm familiar with some of his stuff. Yeah, he's more on also the spiritual side of things. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. His so you had mentioned that Jordan Peterson's 12 Ways for Life was a very like fundamental book for your own understanding. When you say that, I can't help but think about Sam Harris's book End of Faith that was like my reading that book was my like metanoia, if you will. I really got a lot of value from that, and I find myself um, very persuaded by a lot of the things that Sam has to offer. I'm curious to get
Oh,
your take on.
what was it about the book?
So I grew up in a Catholic environment. I went to a Catholic school for grade school and the first 2 years of high school, and it was I never really was exposed to a logical ratiocinate expostulation of those ideas. And so by the time that I started reading Sam Harris, just reading like such a logical breakdown of someone who's not using insults, someone who's not being necessarily rude to the side he's uh, tearing down, so to speak. But I just found that it was very convincing, and I found that his the way he talks about there being plenty of logical reasons to optimize the human experience around love and empathy that has nothing to do with belief in a higher power. That really resonated with me because I do believe that there's reasons to treat people with love and respect and empathy that don't necessarily have to do with anything outside of the human experience in the here and now. That also might sound a bit out there, but that's something that really resonated with me.
Hmm.
Have you read any of his
Um,
books or watched any of his
no, I've
podcasts?
not read any of his books. I actually want to read some of his books. So, the book you mentioned, it is.
End of Faith. It was his first book, 2004. Yeah.
Okay, I need to get that. No, I have not read any of his books. So the first place I actually saw him was on a podcast. So
And
my
whose was
favorite
it?
podcast to listen to is Modern Wisdom, and he
Chris
was one
Williamson,
of
right?
the guests. Yeah,
Yeah, that was a recent podcast they did, like maybe a year or two ago, I think. That was a good one.
yeah. So initially I thought, let me go listen to Sam Ayers' podcast, but I see you've like stepped away from things. He um reduced these social media presence and everything. So it was kind of tough to find like stuff for him unless it's old stuff. But even then, it's like it's timeless for the most part. It's just knowing where to start then becomes an issue. You know, if it's ongoing podcast, I'll just go on the latest episode.
Sure.
Um, yeah, I'll give the book a go because also now I'm starting to look more at the spiritual stuff
Sure.
because I know very little about that I've seen in my experience. And yeah, it's definitely something I'm keen to learn more.
Have you ever talked to anyone who's experienced with, or do you have any opinions on psychedelic use?
No, absolutely nothing. The only thing with psychedelic use is cannabis. And cannabis, I've seen how it can really jack people, but it's not exactly psychedelics. Like now it's being used for medication and stuff, but I've seen like a lot of people have this perception that it is harmless to use it, which is completely false. It genuinely damages um, your brain chemistry, and I've seen the consequences of long term use of it, and the consequences when somebody uses it before the brain is fully developed is also non insignificant. It's quite big and it can be detrimental. What's the word I'm looking for? Like it causes irreparable damage. So in your brain, you have receptors. You have your neurons and you have dendrites. So you literally damage those receptors over time. And the thing is, you become numb to the sensation it offers, and it's the same problem with alcohol as well. It's basically the almost the same mechanism at play. It's anesthetizing to the issue instead of addressing the root cause of things. When people take something repeatedly, um, yeah, if somebody needs to take something repeatedly, it means there is something wrong, like there's an issue they need to deal with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would not advise anybody give it a go. Like, if anything, you might have a genetic predisposition to addiction. So why tempt fate?
So have you
Psychedelics,
ever?
I do not know much. So yeah. Hmm?
I was gonna say. I was gonna ask if you have any experience with cannabis at all.
No, none at all. I've
What's
always
the
been too
legality of it?
scared because I've seen what it's done to people. Yeah.
Is it illegal still where you live in Africa?
Mm, um, it's illegal in a capacity. So now you can have it in your home and consume it, but you're not allowed to sell it as a individual. That's still illegal.
Like
But there's a
decriminalized?
transition. It is basically decriminalized now. Like there's stores selling it openly.
Oh
They're
wow.
advertising big and prominently. Like the one road I drive every day, there's a big sign for a cannabis place. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in the USA, right? So it's very very accepted here. Like I'd say that it's pretty similar to alcohol, honestly, in terms of like its social acceptability. But I would also say that it's very different than psychedelics per se, because while I agree with you that marijuana is very addictive and it
Yeah.
can it can really be an addictive substance, no doubt. I don't necessarily feel that that's true with some of the psychedelic compounds, such as mushrooms or the cactus. What was peyote or lysergic acid diethylamide? Yeah, I'd say like the tendency toward addiction and habitual use is very, very different when it comes to psychedelics versus cannabis. And I know that some people do technically say that, marijuana is a type of psychedelic. Sure, maybe. I don't
Yeah.
disagree or agree per se, but I think you make a really good point when you talk about how many people get addicted to it. And I find, I
Yeah.
guess the point that I'm going to tie this back to is as someone who lives in the USA where it's very, very accepted, I do find it, while I find it, I personally think it's a good thing that it's legal because, tobacco and alcohol is legal. And I think if people want
Yeah.
to do that, it's their right. But I do think it's unfortunate that people are very hesitant to talk about the dangers of it. And I don't think that it's without its dangers. I completely agree with
Yeah.
you. And I think people would do well to exercise more caution around using it, especially under the age of 30.
Yeah. Yeah. And like your brain only, for most people, develops by 25. And even then, there's like leeway. It can develop later for some people, earlier for some people. But it's like a good ballpark figure. So I don't know much about psychedelics. All my knowledge of psychedelics comes from like reading about it or podcasts.
Sure.
Um, but where I would have like some reservations about it is if you look at anything that is more modern, like any new trend, there's typically this life cycle where something new is introduced, and there's a lot of people that champion the good of it, that it seems somewhat revolutionary. And then slowly over time, you know, there's people that have um, negative experiences with something, and where you start seeing the ugly side of whatever it is. So, a simple example is cocaine. Like, I mean, Coke literally had cocaine. Coca Cola literally had cocaine in it. And then we started saying, oh, it's bad. What's this guy's name? Freud. Like, Freud was
He
a
wrote the
big
cocaine
drug
papers.
addict.
Yeah, the cocaine
Yeah,
papers.
because they thought it was good. Like, he thought it's good for my functioning. Like, I'm thinking clearly and everything when I'm taking it. But then over time, you start seeing all the negative side effects of it and so on. Same with alcohol. Like people start taking alcohol, they thought it is fine. And then over time, you start seeing how more research is done on it. You start seeing the people that would say it's good actually have a vested interest in it.
Sure.
If somebody's selling alcohol, they're going to want to tell you it's good. Same with
Yeah, of
cigarettes.
course.
Initially, like there were so many ads saying cigarettes are good for you, you're going to live longer and XYZ.
Well, in America, cigarettes were prescribed by doctors as herbal medicines. Cigarettes.
Yeah, exactly. And now they're doing their best to like try and ban it everywhere because now the industry is not as big. It's dying out slowly. There's more knowledge available. It's better researched. And I imagine the same with psychedelics. Like, there's a lot of people that speak about the good of it, but I have to question, like, all the people that speak about the good experiences normally become the early investors. The people that will put a lot into it to grow the industry. And you see the same with cannabis now. Like, there's a lot of good being spoken about it because now they found a way to commoditize it. I think that's the main reason that it's become legal, or why it's becoming more broadly accepted, where it can be sold in public and everything, is because they found a way to, get a profit out of it. Before, it was kind of tough. There's legal changes that happen. And I imagine the same will be with psychedelics. Like, there's a lot said about the good, but what about the bad? There's not much yet being said about it. And I've seen videos of people in the jungle, and they look like they are neither here nor there. There's a lot of horror stories as well, where somebody had the seemingly perfect life, and then they go on an ayahuasca trip, and they come home, and they suddenly a completely different person. They look like they are in the pit all the time, continually depressed. Like, there are people that have life-changing experiences that are so good for them, where they come back and they feel revitalized. But there's also the other side, and people will do more to hide the negative reviews than the good endorsements. So you never get a full picture. And even like if you've been excited to try anything new, you tend to focus on the good things if you have an interest in it. If you want to buy a Ferrari, like, you're going to think about all the good things of the Ferrari because you think it's going to be good. But then, you kind of become blinded to the negative sides of why you should not get that car, for instance.
Absolutely. But even so, I find it to be a great travesty that they've been illegal for so long because they're not necessarily new trends. Like, these things they're compounds that have been leveraged in ancient civilizations for millennia. I think there's
Even then, like, if you look at the people that would do it, it would typically be the elders. They would be the ones overlooking it. They would say if they advise somebody do it, it was somebody experienced, somebody capable, somebody who has also seen the bad of it, that knows it's not for everybody.
absolutely.
And
Well, and
now
there's
it's
also
not the case.
yeah, that's a good point. I think yeah, I mean there have been civilizations that have used these compounds for like rites of passages. So there are like younger people who have used them and not gotten addicted to them. But to your
Mm,
point, they're typically experiences that are guided or administered by elders or people who have been exposed to both the good and the bad. So
yeah.
to your point, like yeah, that it is a good point. I think it's something that like you look at like what they're trying to do with maps and multidisciplinary association for psychedelic research or
Hmm.
something of that nature, and they have a lot of these like studies with people who are like war veterans and people who suffer from PTSD, and it seems like a lot of these things show just as much potential, if not more, than a lot of the traditional pharmaceutical compounds. And those
Hmm.
are also not free of their dangers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like, there's no such thing as a perfect medicine as well. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, a book that I really like, Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It speaks to a lot of times doctors merely try and treat you now. They don't care about the long-term consequences of something.
It's like to parse through all the information and make sense of what's good and what isn't is almost like a full-time job if you really think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite tough. Like, it's a lot easier to what's the principle? I don't remember the name for it. The razor, but it's a lot easier to produce PS than it is to disprove it. It requires a lot more effort
Yeah,
because we have this bias, the recency bias. So we are more likely to believe the more recent information than the one that comes up afterwards. Like, if you learn 1 plus 1 is 3, you're going to believe that until, it's actually proven without any doubt. It's a lot tougher to change somebody's mind than it is to create an initial mindset.
Is that referred to as the anchoring bias?
Oh, anchoring bias. Sorry. Yeah.
Is that is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I had studied some of the cognitive biases a few years back, and there's like hundreds of them. But yeah, that what you described sounded very familiar, so I figured I'd see if that was accurate. That's interesting. I just thought of a question for you, and I don't know if maybe I'll cut this part out, but
I have no idea. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I always go on the side of caution. Yeah, because I had an episode where I spoke about serial killers and psychopaths, so I normally just make that like age restricted in case to avoid any issue. When I look thinking about like what is a hot topic on YouTube, doing the podcast, it becomes also very tempting to chase the views. When you see a particular episode you make that gets a lot of views, like a lot more than you typically do, it kind of gives a sense that maybe I should make more of that content. That sort of temptation creeps in, and that's something I find myself having to guard against, just trying to chase the views, remember why I did it, why I do the podcast. Like, sure, I might want to do more of that, but it shouldn't be, I'm merely going to just focus on that because I see that gets attention, yeah.
what's like the most amount of views that you've gotten on one of your videos?
Geez, I don't know. I think like, is it 400 or something like that? Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, so it was an episode with a relationship counselor, yeah.
And why do you think that got so many more views than like than typical? Was it a certain clip that you posted that like really got it a lot of eyes on it, or was it maybe something else?
Yeah, so with that one, I posted clips every single day. So I posted on TikTok every single day, focused on using tags and stuff. And I think it was also the subject matter, like it was relationship focused. And a lot of the clips I made were about relationships. So I think that gave it a lot of traction, where the other topics maybe aren't the most glamorous or the most interesting for most people. Like the one that surprised me was the fishing episode. So fishing as in, scams, digital scams. That one got like 200, but I think that was also, they were researchers and lecturers and they shared it with people. A big thing that makes a difference is whether the guests themselves also go and share the episode. Whether they promote it as well on their platforms, whether they tell people they know. That is quite instrumental. Like I've seen with some episodes, I can tell when the guest did not tell anybody at all, because then it's like pretty much just the subscribers watched, friends who'd watch, and maybe a few family members.
Right. I know what I want to. I just thought of a question that I really wanted to ask you that just popped into my head. You mentioned TikTok. As a new content creator, how do you kind of look at TikTok in terms of their privacy policies and their terms of service and the alleged invasiveness of their platform when compared to some of the other social media platforms?
I don't know enough about that, to be honest.
Okay.
So the reason I went with TikTok at first and not Instagram, the only main issue I have with Instagram is I can't schedule posts on the laptop. If I want to schedule, I have to first do it on the phone, download it on the phone, and upload it on the phone to schedule it. It's just a lot more work. TikTok, I can schedule everything, like do my shorts over the weekend, schedule it to go out in the week, and do all of that on the laptop, not having to do the editing on the laptop, then transfer it to my Google Drive, then download it from my Google Drive onto my phone. It's just a lot more convenient. In terms of the privacy concerns, I think in any platform that is an issue. I think it's just more overstated with TikTok. Because I always question, like, when people talk about the issues, because I saw the biggest concern was it's, or one of the conspiracies is that it is a Chinese social engineering weapon sort of thing. You know, that they're getting people in the West information, um,
Biometric data.
yeah, biometric data that you show, like you've basically dumbed the nation down to make them weaker and all of those sort of conspiracy things. But why is there not this concern with Instagram and not with Facebook or anything else? And then you look at, is it merely because it's a Chinese social media app? Like, part of me also is a bit critical of that. Is it that China is a growing economic hub, a growing world power? So villainize them to, try and hinder their progress somewhat, or
That's a really good point.
it's that side that I also start questioning how much truth is there to it. And I don't think we as people have the possibility to actually find the answers to it and actually see if it is true or not. It's the same with Instagram. Like, I've seen what Instagram pushes to me. I don't use Instagram much, and a lot of it is also brain rotting material, and I'm like, am I getting more brain rot on TikTok than I am from Instagram? No. And I'm not reading all the policies and stuff. Like, when it says, yeah, do you consent or agree, I always just click agree. So I don't know the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, so does everyone. Everyone does that too. I mean, I just feel like maybe it's more of like a hot button issue in America because, like you said, like, TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese corporation, and I think with America kind of being on the I think there's more hostility towards the growing economic power that China poses, I guess. And so in America, as a country that's, I guess, more hostile with China and the economic threats, if you will, maybe it's a bit of a different perception amongst Americans. But yeah, I think you're right when you say that it's not really any different when you look at Instagram or the invasiveness of any other social media thing. It really isn't any. I mean, I actually don't know. I shouldn't make that claim, but I can't imagine it's that much different. They're probably all doing the same type of thing.
Yeah, and I need to research it more actually, because I imagine, and I think that's actually a good thought for me to go and research, like, see if I can find somebody who's more knowledgeable on that. Like, that's, again, if you want to guess, think what you don't know, what you would like to know, and then
that's a good point.
You can find somebody on it.
Yeah, I should reach out to like privacy attorneys or something and see if they know anything about this, because that would be an interesting thing to know, like how they see that information and data being leveraged against us. Because I don't really have a good answer to that. Yeah, that's something I probably should try to get on. It'd be interesting. We've been going for 56 minutes. I haven't even looked at my second question yet.
How are you with time? I'm still good. If you want to.
All right, awesome. Do you work any like jobs now outside of like the content creation, or are you doing this content full time right now?
I tutor part time, so I have like one student tutor him twice a week. I don't think I would. My only motivation to do a job would be just to get money from it. Yeah, so I can get like stuff, sustain myself. But I wouldn't want something too intense that takes away too much energy and focus from my studies, and then also from podcasts as well. Yeah.
Sure. Aside from podcasting and psychology and philosophy and things of that nature, what other things do you find yourself interested in or drawn to?
Oh, what do I find? So something I do in addition to the podcast is also a weekly newsletter. So I've actually grown fond of writing as well.
That's funny you say that. I do the same thing.
Yeah, so the newsletter is like super handy. Like, you, like, every week thinking of what do I want to write about. That also helps with the introspection for me, because then it's what am I struggling with in the week? What story have I read that really inspires me, and how can I give a message from it? Or, it's helping to articulate my thoughts and look at the world differently. So the newsletter, a lot of ideas I draw into the podcast as well. It's never going to be in vain. It's like a personal blog sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's very funny to hear you say that because I recently, like a few weeks ago, so pretty recently, started doing the exact same thing. I just started sending like Beehive newsletters. I don't have like any subscribers on them, but I just find it's a very good way to like articulate and express your thoughts without having conversations with people per se. Because sometimes I'm just like,
Yeah.
I'll just be like, busy doing something, but I'll have like something that I want to think through or just get on paper or on digital paper rather. And I find it very, very, very nice to do that. So I've been doing the same thing. It's funny to hear you say that. Just like the writing skills alone, I think it's because it is a skill. It's something that you can't just expect to like be really good at and be like really efficient at right away. Over time, like if you're writing every week, like you're going to get better at it. Same thing with podcasting, right? Like not everyone's a good interlocutor. Some people don't ask, like some people don't know how, like what questions to ask or how to talk to people who are strangers, but it's a skill that you develop over time if you're doing it regularly. I just find those two things so valuable because no matter what job you might want to do or no matter what like career path you take, being able to inquire and being able to have a dialogue with people that that you're not necessarily like that you don't know, and being able to write and communicate your inner thoughts and it's very it's an evergreen skill that can be applied to almost any career path, don't you think?
Yeah, no, it's got utility elsewhere, definitely. It's a very transferable skill to have,
Yeah.
and if I think, like, you don't know where your weaknesses or lack of skills are until you actually engage in something.
Very true.
Action gives you a lot of information. You start seeing, like, when you do the podcast, you start seeing, well, I'm struggling to, con- have this thought, form this thought, or to present it in a nice and articulate manner. And you start seeing, as you talk with somebody, you see all your stutters and you see what you can work on, And then it feels
Absolutely.
good when you do it deliberately over time and you start seeing the progress. You start seeing how you're able to take a simple idea and expand it. You start seeing, oh, maybe I'm not the good listener I thought I was. Like this person said so many things, but I don't remember any of it. And then, it's a muscle you start building.
Yeah.
Something you've probably heard Jordan Peterson say is you have to be willing to be a fool if you want to become a master in anything.
Yeah, sure.
You have to have that humility that I'm not where I want to be at, but if I consistently and diligently work at it, I will reach the top of the mountain. The battle isn't won with a single punch. Like, you don't win a fight with just one knockout punch all the time. It's the 1,000 jabs that you throw throughout the bout.
Absolutely.
And repeatedly doing the things, when you do the podcast, you start seeing your little ticks, the things you can work on bit by bit. It's a continuous process. Being immersed in the moment, repeatedly writing as well, you start seeing, okay, what am I struggling with writing? It could be you don't know where to start, then that in itself also is communicating something to you that you do not have a voice. It's one thing to be able to speak, and it's another thing to have a voice. Having a voice means that you have something to say. So then it becomes, okay, I need to have an interest in something. I need to engage in more things. Because this is a problem that a lot of comedians run into, Like they'll be successful at first because they have all these jokes, they're doing all of the stuff. But when they're doing the thing, they realize, oh, I'm not doing the thing that gives me the actual content. I'm constantly in a tour bus. All my jokes are going to be like that, about that lifestyle,
Right.
and nobody's going to relate with it. Then it becomes, okay, I need to go and do other things outside of just comedy shows, perpetually The writing as well, for me, it's doing it. I start seeing, okay, what do people find interesting? Because if I write something, then I speak with a friend, I can see what stories resonated with them, what did they enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you ever make videos on YouTube or otherwise, or maybe other social media videos that aren't necessarily podcasts, but just like videos about things that you're interested in that you want to like talk about? Have you ever done any of that?
Um, yeah, it's something I'm exploring now because in terms of the podcast, like the shorts that I've been making is just the podcast content. So it'll be like a snippet of something that was said in the episodes. But people don't just listen to the podcast for the content necessarily. And it's something a friend um, articulated very well to me. And it's, you can't just be a blank slate. People need to, people want to be able to relate with the person they are listening to. And in movies, there's a reason they do a lot of exposition. They let you know who the character is, they give you the backstory. If you think of the villains that people like the most, they typically have stories that are very relatable. If you think of one of my favorite villains recently, Thanos, you can understand why he had that view, that ideology.
Yeah.
And people like to relate with characters. And what's going to distinguish your podcast from anybody else's podcast? Sure, you could say, I'm going to have this type of conversation, but anybody else could do it. If you look at, there's a lot of content in terms of like thrillers and horror stories and those sort of things. But what sets them apart? It's the storyteller, it's the person doing it. And I've been thinking, okay, what content can I create that communicates something about myself?
Sure.
So something I'm exploring is making shorts um, that is more like something I'm struggling with. So maybe just an idea or something, because I don't have to share exactly who I am, my life story, and all of that. I might do that like over time. If people listen, they'll catch snippets here and there. But it's, I can't say exactly what I'm gonna do. The one thing I thought is taking the books I read and like just recording. So I have played around recording it, but then I'm like, I want to try something else.
Are
So
you familiar
it's
with
a lot of prototyping and trying to figure out. Yeah.
do you know the Instagram profile Tay Rosen, I think his name is? He's like one of my favorite Instagram content creators. I don't spend that much time on Instagram at
Mm-hmm.
all, but this guy makes awesome content. I'm gonna try to find his username because he basically just reads all these books and watches all these movies, and then I'll make like Instagram videos of his own analysis. But yeah, Tay Rosen on Instagram. He's got like 380,000 followers. So he probably makes a living just talking about like books and film. But when you said that, I thought of him in his profile.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
should look into him. He's good stuff.
yeah. Yeah, because that's one of the things I'm also thinking. How can you give value to people? Like, I don't want to just make content for the sake of it to just get followers or whatever.
Right.
It's how can you give value? Like with him, if I just think he's reading books, watching movies, and then he's giving reviews with his own style. So, two ways I can see he's producing value is you saving time for people on the one hand, that's something valuable for people. You giving information what movies are worth watching, and then also you giving a different viewpoint that people might not have got, and then I imagine there's also entertainment from it.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm also struggling with when I'm thinking what content do I want to make. So
Well, I think there's a lot of value in curation, right? Like people that are interested in a certain subset of interests find a lot of value in curation or content aggregators. Like you think about how like Cody Co on YouTube is like a
mm,
huge YouTuber. He's got millions of subscribers And his whole channel is he's just sitting in front of his computer, aggregating other YouTube videos and commentating on it. And the reality is that people can, uh, in a perfect world, right? People identify with your most authentic self, right? But the reality is,
Yeah.
when you're creating content, people relate to a specific aspect or aspects of your persona that they can see themselves in, and that's what's relatable. And so I think there's a lot of value in people who can aggregate content that relates to the persona that they're talking to.
Yeah, exactly. And it's as much as we try to be congruent, everybody has a certain perception of us. Each person sees us differently, and they um, make their own assumptions about things about you, just based off the way you look, the way you sound. Um, yeah, and I think the best measure for any content is creating the stuff you would want to watch yourself, because then at least one person enjoys it. It's you.
It's probably a lot easier too to like you're taking a lot of the workload off of like trying to ideate what content. Oh, like because you mentioned earlier you don't want to become the guy who's just creating content to get views. So that's like a really like good tangible piece of advice. Like okay, well for the person who says, well okay, I'm not going to create content about the things that get views. Now what the heck do I make content about? Well, like what do you enjoy watching, right? Like that's a really good tangible piece of advice, I think. Just thinking about what you would consume and where those gaps exist, and then trying to bridge those gaps with your own voice, right? I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, and I think also not just that, what you do that you enjoy, it's also you have to think if it is up to the quality standard you want. And people don't know, like, people only know what works. Yeah, people only know what has worked until now. They don't know what will work in the future. And a good example, something I wrote about recently, is Steph Curry exemplifies it amazingly. Are you familiar with the scout report? Have you seen it?
The scout report.
Yeah, before he got drafted, like what the scout report said.
I'm not very familiar with it, but I'm imagining that it's not very. It doesn't speak very highly of his abilities.
No. So the key takeaways for me, or like the main points, are he is too small. He shoots too much. He needs to shoot less because he won't be as efficient unless he cuts down on his shooting. He's not a traditional point guard, and he cannot run a team because he is not a traditional point guard.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, what is not true there? He indeed is pretty small, like he was scrawny and everything.
Yeah.
He did shoot a lot. He is not a traditional point guard, but he most definitely could be the main player on the team and run the team. And
Yeah,
it's,
he's the best, right?
everybody had this idea of a way a point guard should be up until that moment. There was this ideal skill set. This is how the game should be played, and this is how the game will always be played. And then
Absolutely.
he came along, and he shot from everywhere. Like, one of the critiques also was he rushes into shots.
Yeah.
That is like his trademark thing now, where he will shoot from anywhere. Like, he can get the ball at half court, and people have to start marking him already. It's
Right.
nobody even imagined that this would become the norm, where the 3-point is like the main thing in basketball. And he came to revolutionize it. And
Yeah.
it's him being himself and having the right people around him, the right management, the right coach that, looked at this and was like, there's something special about him. How can we cultivate it? And, as a content creator, you need to do that for yourself. It's the world does not see through your eyes. You need to create that vision for others to see. Once you get results, once you continuously do it, it becomes undeniable. Steph Curry, like, as good as he was, he had to show that he is that good. That if he does this, it can be revolutionary. And in doing it, you actually show, you give evidence to people that this is a different way of doing things.
Yeah, he really did revolutionize the game. That's a good way to put it. And I think they said the same thing about Tom Brady too, right? Like they said he was like, too slow, or he doesn't have like enough arm strength. Meanwhile, he ended up being empirically, quantifiably the best to ever do it, revolutionizing the game. So yeah, I mean those are two like really good examples of that. And then the way you bring it back to content creation, that's such a great point. Because I think with content, especially people who are starting to make content, they kind of just, I mean, and this is human nature, but they kind of just start, myself included, we just like look at like, hey, what are
Yeah.
other people doing and what could I emulate? And I think to a certain degree that's maybe necessary to a degree to get started. But your point about how you really have to be able to transcend the vision that others have for what you're trying to do, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, yeah. Even another funny example that just popped in my head is when you are looking for a partner, like a wife, a girlfriend, whatever, you don't want somebody that is average. You don't want to have like somebody that's exactly like everybody else. You want to feel the person that you are with is different in some
Yeah.
capacity. You know, you look for something different about the person. Same with the stuff you
The difference is probably something that you'd like to be able to relate to, right? And so that goes back to the persona thing. So I kind of interrupted you there. I didn't mean to, but it just made me think of what we were talking about earlier. The last question I have listed here is how have you been looking to grow your podcast and your other efforts? Are there certain marketing strategies that you would recommend to a new podcaster?
Yeah, so something I'm looking at is doing more in a simple word. So number one, like now I've been just uploading shorts onto TikTok. So there's like it's an easy change I can make is uploading to everywhere else as well.
Like
Uploading
taking the
to
same clips and putting them on Instagram also, right?
yeah, on Instagram and then on LinkedIn as well. And then also looking at other content I can make. So stuff I've worked on um, is for like Instagram. So I have the newsletter and then taking a snippet or like a key quote from the newsletter and creating like a post out of it. So I've got templates for that up. Um, Something I've made now that yeah, it's gonna go out this Monday. So to give like an incentive for somebody that signs up to the newsletter or shares it with somebody is a reading list, a book list of books that I found to have the biggest impact on me. Um, then the other thing I'm also thinking is because it's like an incentive for somebody to share the newsletter. So if they send it, they get the reading list. How could I do it on a what's the word I'm looking for ongoing basis where it's not just once off. So it's like making a guest reading list is something that came as a idea in my mind. So asking each guest I have on what is one book they would recommend that they found to be life changing. So then like every 20 episodes I have a new list, you know, 20
Yeah.
guests, 20 books, that's a new list. So then it's like 20 episodes down the line, then if people share again, they get this new reading list. Looking at other stuff that I could also create because maybe I do like a tier thing. So if you recommend one person, you get the reading list, but if you recommend three, then you get this like other resource. So working on digital products. So using the newsletter as sort of a funnel for the podcast, but also having it be its own thing as well.
And would you ever consider like just writing newsletters about each like guest's book recommendation and then maybe trying to get the guests to share that newsletter also to like grow that way, or would that maybe be like overkill, do you think?
Yeah, that's actually smart. No, that's not something I actually thought about. Yeah, you've planted an idea in my mind. Yeah.
All right, I'm glad then. That's awesome. Are you willing to say the name of your newsletter? I'd love to be able to like shout it out.
Oh, yeah. My newsletter is called Psych Mondays, but it's not like anybody will be able to find it anyway. Like, if they want to sign up, it's linked in my YouTube, Instagram, all the social media channels.
Okay, awesome. Do you would it be okay with you if I took that link and threw it in the bio of this video when I go to post it on YouTube?
Oh no, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to do it. It sounds like a pretty cool newsletter. I'll definitely be subscribing to it. I actually just made a note to ask you what the name is, and so I'm gonna go to your bio and after this, and I'll be sure to subscribe to it for sure.
Yeah, no, I would really appreciate it. Like the more places it's out there, the better. Um, yeah, in terms of like what else to promote the newsletter, to promote the podcast, like one of the things that literally with my newsletter, I grew it by just going up to random people and asking them sign up for the newsletter. Hey,
Wow.
like first talk with them, engage in conversation, and be like, hey, by the way, I got this newsletter that I send out every Monday, um, where I use like storytelling. So I tell a story with a message behind it, and then as an example, I use the last newsletter that I wrote. So tell them, hey, this week I wrote about let me think, what was my last one? Jeez, I can't. Oh yeah, the last one was where we had Comic Con this weekend, and there was an
Okay.
experience that stuck in my mind where my friend was deciding should he buy this Goku Black Funko Pop, and the moment resonated with me, and it stuck in my mind because we have this notion in our mind that we can predict the outcome of every decision, and we tend to inflate the importance of our decisions. And there's two mistakes. Number one, how many times have you actually thought something will be good or something will be bad, and then it actually uh, went against your expectations? And then, in terms of that, like how often are analysts correct? So it tied in with a book I'm reading called Uncharted by Margaret Heffernan, and it's in terms of the markets. Like there were so many times people predict there's gonna be a crash, and then every year people would run the same story until one year there is a crash, and then it's like, oh, this person was some sort of has some clairvoyant ability.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they've been saying it every single year, so it was bound to happen. It's like somewhat of an inevitability, but it doesn't mean they were right. They just happened to be right by coincidence. And telling them the story, and then you know see if they're interested in it, then sign up for it. The podcast as well, like just say, go up to a random person, be like, hey, this is the podcast I'm doing, this is what my last guest was, this was what the podcast is about, and then asking people. So yeah, there is a lot of value in still doing the legwork, like going up and talking with random people.
Yeah, guerrilla
you
marketing,
know
right?
yeah, like you learn sales skills, like those are invaluable in anything. Everything is sales.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
yeah, we all selling ourselves in some capacity. Yeah.
To be honest with you, like as I'm just starting my own podcast and stuff like that, I haven't really thought too much about like marketing and how to grow it. Because honestly, like my focus right now, like this is the first time I'm even using Riverside, like a proper podcasting platform. So my
Yeah, yeah.
my my like mind has always been like just get into the habit of like getting decent at talking to people and asking good questions and actually just doing the podcast and going through the motions, getting consistent with that before I like put any like thought into marketing. I don't know if that's like a healthy way to think about it or not, but nonetheless, I'm just kind of sharing like
Yeah.
how I've been thinking about it.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that.
You do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that approach. It's this idea I got from Naval Ravikant. It's start off small, find what works, experiment as much as you can until you find exactly what it is that you need to do, and then you scale it up and you see with how you can repeat it over and over and over. The
Yeah.
moment you go big, you start limiting yourself a lot because you get tied into this is what I must do, because you become hesitant to change things. The biggest something is you start thinking, I don't want to mess this up. But when it is
Yeah.
small, you are going to be a lot more creative. Like, that's the value of practice. If practice is a low stakes situation where you can do something repeatedly, but you can also try different permutations and nuances of it. If you're kicking a ball against the wall, you will practice like kicking harder, softer, kicking with a different part of your foot. But if you're in a match, then it's going to be like, you're going to think twice about doing that risky action unless you are certain you can do it perfectly without any issue.
Yeah, I guess another reason that I've been hesitant to like jump the gun and try to focus on more than like on like the marketing and stuff like that is because it's like I also feel like as I'm just getting started, like there's a lot of new learning and there's a learning curve to understanding how to do this stuff, and I almost feel like on some level like if you try to focus on doing a bunch of different things at the same time, something's gonna drop off in terms of quality or consistency. And so I guess I'm just trying to, all that to say that I'm really just trying to focus on being consistent about just doing like the podcast and being good about like finding the right types of guests. And I think a lot of that
Yeah.
marketing, like they'll, like you said earlier, like there's clarity in taking action, right? So it's like I almost feel like a lot of the stuff that will clue me into how I should be marketing myself and this podcast will come on the back end of having quality conversations with the right people. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like, you also need to see what you can do. Like, the more widespread you are, the less focused you are. It's like a lens with light. If the lens is, yeah, if the light coming through the lens is unfocused, it's not gonna, like, if you're trying to burn a piece of paper with a
Right.
magnifying glass, you want the light focused, you want it on a single point, and then as that gets hotter, it spreads, the fire spreads. You don't need to focus on getting the light to hit the whole surface of the paper. It hits that point, the rest of the paper will burn.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Keenan, we've been doing this for about an hour and a half. What do you say? Should we wrap this up?
Yeah, sure, let's wrap it up.